A gray Russian morning, an industrial district that doesn't appear on tourist maps, and a line of trucks rolling through a gate like they own the world. On the paperwork, the cargo is boring. Industrial equipment, cooling units, civilian components. But Ukraine has learned a brutal truth in this war. The most dangerous weapons don't always arrive with a cannon. They arrive with a barcode. Because when Russia's newest strike drones started showing up in larger numbers, long-range, cheap, relentless, investigators and intelligence agencies kept finding the same fingerprints underneath the casing: Chinese engines, Chinese navigation, Chinese electronics, and the moment those crates get opened, the clock starts. In July 2025, a Ukrainian drone strike hit a major defense facility in Izhevsk, more than 1,000 kilometers from the front, killing 3 and seriously injuring dozens, according to regional authorities and reporting from RFE/RL. Ukrainian sources said the target was the Kupol plant, linked to systems like the Tor air defense system and the Garpia drone program. That's the modern battlefield in one sentence. A civilian shipment shows up, a factory turns it into a weapon, and Ukraine tries to erase it before it ever reaches the sky over Kyiv. So today we're breaking down the real story behind the clickbait. Not fantasy, not rumor. The documented pipeline, how Russia's new weapons are evolving, and how China, directly or indirectly, has become part of the machinery that keeps them coming. And stay with me, because the most advanced weapon in this entire story isn't a missile. It's a thread. The setup. This isn't China shipping tanks. It's worse. Let's clear the air. You will hear people say, China isn't involved, because Beijing publicly maintains it's neutral and says it hasn't provided lethal weapons to either side. And you will hear people say, China is arming Russia, because Western governments have sanctioned Chinese firms and accused them of directly enabling Russia's drone program. Both statements can be true, depending on what you mean by arming. Because the new reality of war is this: if you supply the engine, you supplied the strike. If you supply the navigation, you supplied the target. If you supply the factory pathway, you supplied the battlefield. And that's why this matters far beyond Ukraine, because every new drone Russia builds doesn't just hit a building. It drags the world closer to a future where sanctions are optional, and war production is globalized behind a thin mask of civilian trade. Now let's go weapon by weapon, because Russia's new weapons are not one thing. They're an ecosystem. Segment 1. The Garpia, Russia's new Chinese-powered strike drone. Russia's long-range drone war started with Iranian-designed Shahed drones, rebranded as Geran, swarming Ukrainian cities night after night. Then came the next step: Russia building more of its own long-range one-way drones at scale, trying to reduce reliance on outside suppliers, while still relying on outside components. Reuters reported that European intelligence and documents indicated Russia began producing a newer long-range attack drone called Garpia, and that it relied on Chinese technology, including components tied to Chinese companies, alongside customs data showing millions of dollars in imported goods routed through intermediaries. Here's why Garpia matters. It's not a superweapon in the sci-fi sense. It's something far more dangerous. A weapon you can build in huge numbers. A weapon you can launch in waves. A weapon that turns air defense into a math problem. According to Reuters reporting, Garpia was described as having a takeoff weight under 300 kilograms and a range of about 1,500 kilometers, under a production contract described in the report: 1,500 kilometers. That's not just frontline pressure, that's depth. That's strategic reach. That's the ability to threaten targets far from the trenches. Now add the part people don't like to say out loud. When the heart of a weapon system, its engine, its control systems, its navigation, comes from abroad, it doesn't matter how loudly you claim independence. You're still importing lethality, and the U.S. noticed. In October 2024, the U.S. Treasury announced sanctions targeting Chinese entities accused of being involved in drone production for Russia, describing it as the first time the U.S. sanctioned PRC entities directly developing and producing complete weapon systems in partnership with Russian firms. That's not normal diplomatic language. That's an alarm bell. Because once you cross the line from dual-use parts exist in the market to we believe firms are helping produce complete systems, you are no longer talking about accidents. You're talking about industrial intent. But if you think Garpia is the ceiling, you're not watching the right files. Segment 2, the Garpia-3, the drone project inside China. Now it gets uncomfortable. In September 2024, Reuters reported that documents reviewed by the agency indicated that Kupol, a subsidiary of Russia's state arms group, Almaz-Antey, developed and flight-tested a drone model called Garpia-3, G3, in China with help from local specialists, and that Kupol reported it could produce drones at scale at a factory in China for use in the war. Read that again. Not parts shipped, not chips found. A program described as development and testing in China, with scale production discussed. Reuters report also said the G3 could travel about 2,000 kilometers with a 50-kilogram payload, according to the documents described. 2,000 kilometers. That's the distance between rear areas and front lines disappearing. And in those same Reuters details, there's another line that should make every defense planner sit up. Kupol reportedly outlined readiness within months to produce another UAV concept with a 400-kilogram payload, described by the sources as something like a U.S. Reaper-class capability. Now, does that mean Russia suddenly has a Reaper tomorrow? Number. But it tells you the direction. Russia isn't just improving the drone, it's building a ladder. From cheap, disposable terror drones to long-range strike drones, to heavy UAV platforms that start blurring into what used to require manned aircraft. And then, in September 2025, Reuters reported that Chinese drone experts had flown to Russia and visited Kupol multiple times for technical work on military-use drones, according to officials and documents described by Reuters. China's foreign ministry said it was unaware. That's the pattern in this war. Accusation, denial, sanctions, and meanwhile, the drones keep flying. Because here's the secret. Russia doesn't need China to announce it's helping. Russia only needs the pipeline to stay open. And it does. Segment 3. The cooling units trick. How engines slip through sanctions. Now let's talk about how this pipeline survives. In July 2025, Reuters reported details about Chinese engines powering Russian drones, including allegations that engines were shipped under misleading labels, like cooling units, and that Ukrainian military intelligence described Chinese components in the drone, including engine and navigation elements. And this is where the clickbait title starts to feel real, because imagine being the Ukrainian analyst watching a supply route. A truck convoy moves like any other. No missile pods visible, no tanks, no flags, just crates. But if those crates contain engines, navigation kits, control modules, then that convoy is not logistics. It's a future air raid. And every engine that makes it through is one more drone that forces Ukraine to burn air defense interceptors, scramble aircraft, shut down power, and spend money it can't spare. This is why Europe started pressing China harder. Reuters reported EU officials urging China to curb the flow of specific dual-use goods that sustain Russia's military machine, and describing European concern that Chinese firms' support poses a threat to European security, because the war has taught everyone a lesson. You don't have to ship a tank to shape a battlefield. You only have to ship the parts that keep the tank factory running. But the scariest new weapon Russia has fielded in this war? It isn't even the long-range drone. It's what Russia started using when electronic warfare turned the sky into static. Segment 4. The Thread. Fiber-optic drones that laugh at jamming. Electronic warfare is supposed to be the antidote to drones. Jam the signal, spoof the GPS, blind the operator. And for a while that worked. Then someone brought a spool. Fiber-optic FPV drones, controlled through a physical cable, are designed to be far more resistant to radio jamming. No radio link to break. Just a thin thread connecting operator to drone like a nervous system stretched across the battlefield. And in October 2025, the Washington Post reported that Chinese exports of key components, like fiber-optic cables and lithium-ion batteries, surged to Russia, with trade data showing dramatic increases and highlighting how these components support Russia's drone capabilities. The reported scale is staggering. One figure cited in that reporting, a record export volume in August 2025 measured in the hundreds of thousands of miles of fiber cable. And that changes the tactical equation. Because a jam-resistant drone doesn't just hit targets, it forces every unit in the field to adapt. Trenches become visible, vehicles become hunted. Even the act of moving becomes a risk calculation. This is why analysts have been warning that supply chain control is strategy. CSIS described how China's restrictions and the broader UAV supply chain dynamics can shape battlefield leverage and negotiating power, because the parts flow decides who can sustain drone war at scale. And once you understand that, you realize advanced weapons aren't only built in labs. They're built in factories that can churn out the same component 10 million times. But Russia didn't stop at better guidance. It kept pushing the most ruthless idea in modern warfare. If the weapon is cheap enough, you can turn it into anything. Segment 5. The drone that hunts aircraft. This is where the war enters a new phase, because drones used to be the prey. Now they're being armed to become predators. In December 2025, reporting based on Ukraine's military intelligence described Russia modifying Shahed-type drones, Iran variants, by adding air-to-air missiles, like the Soviet-era R-60, to threaten Ukrainian aircraft and helicopters involved in intercepting drones. And the same reporting described those drones as still containing foreign-made parts, including components from multiple countries, including China. That's the new weapons story in its purest form. Not a brand new platform, a brutal adaptation. A warhead and a guidance system are modular now. The battlefield is a laboratory. And if you think this is just some niche modification that won't matter, remember how fast drone warfare moved from annoyance to dominant. The innovation curve in war isn't linear. It's a cliff, and Russia is trying to climb it faster than sanctions can slow it down. So what does Ukraine do? It doesn't just shoot drones out of the sky. It tries to assassinate the production line. Segment 6. Ukraine's answer. Kill the factory, not the drone. Here's the mistake people make. They watch a drone hit a building and assume the war is only about intercepting the next one. Ukraine has increasingly aimed deeper, at assembly sites, at refineries, at plants. In April 2025, Reuters reported Ukraine's military said it hit a long-range drone production site in Tatarstan, saying damage was caused to the final assembly line, while Reuters noted it couldn't independently verify the claim. The same report referenced Ukraine's claim that the plant's production capacity was 300 drones per day. 300 per day. Even if reality is lower, the intent is clear. Russia wants drone mass. Ukraine wants to choke it. And that battlefield is not just in the air above Kyiv. It's in industrial zones thousands of kilometers away. This isn't hypothetical. In April 2024, Reuters reported strikes in Tatarstan that hit industrial sites and injured people, with Ukrainian sources describing military targets and Russia acknowledging attacks near facilities tied in reporting to drone production, and independent analysts have tried to assess these strikes. The Institute for Science and International Security published an assessment of the April 2024 strike on the Alabuga Special Economic Zone, discussing available visuals and damage indications tied to buildings and dormitories in the area. Then you have the deep strikes like the one reported in Izhevsk in July 2025. Where the mere fact of a successful hit forced airport closures across multiple regions, according to reporting. This is Ukraine's strategic bet. You cannot win a pure interceptor war forever. Not when the enemy is building cheaper weapons faster than you can buy missiles. So instead, you hit the factory. You hit the assembly line. You hit the workers' dorms. You hit the logistics nodes. You turn mass production into mass disruption. And when those shipments roll in, you try to make sure they never roll out again. The big picture, what China siding with Russia looks like in 2025. Now let's zoom out. This isn't about one convoy, it's about alignment. In December 2025, Reuters reported comments from Ukraine's President Zelensky claiming China was taking steps to intensify cooperation with Russia, particularly in the military-industrial sector, framing it as a major concern. China's position remains that it's not providing lethal weapons and that it controls exports. And yet, U.S. sanctions, Reuters reporting, and documented supply chains keep pointing back to the same reality. Even if Beijing claims neutrality, Chinese industry has become one of the key gravitational forces in the modern drone supply chain, globally. And Russia is exploiting that, sometimes through direct relationships, sometimes through intermediaries, sometimes through labels that don't match what's inside the crate. So when you hear the clickbait line, Ukraine watched Russia unpack China's new weapons. Here's the real translation. Ukraine is watching Russia turn global commerce into a weapons feed, and Ukraine is trying, desperately, to interrupt it before those parts become explosions over apartment blocks. Re-engagement. The question that changes everything. Here's the question nobody wants to answer out loud. If the most decisive weapons in modern war are built from global supply chains, can sanctions ever truly stop them? Or are we entering an era where neutrality simply means the war passes through your factories quietly? Because in this conflict, the difference between peace and destruction can be as small as a shipment of motors, a spool of fiber, a crate of navigation boards. The final lesson. War isn't just fought with steel, it's fought with supply. This is not a story about China shipping tanks into Ukraine. It's a story about something colder, war by enablement. A drone engine here, a control board there, a factory relationship that never makes the front page. And the result is a battlefield where Russia can keep launching new, advanced weapons, not because it suddenly became unstoppable, but because the global economy has so many cracks that weapons-grade technology can still flow through. Ukraine understands that. That's why it hunts factories. That's why it targets assembly lines. Because if you can't stop every drone in the sky, you stop the next 1,000 at the source. And in modern warfare, that is the difference between surviving the night and losing a city block. If you value this kind of breakdown, where we strip away the clickbait and map the real machinery behind modern conflict, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and share it with someone who still thinks war is only about tanks and trenches. Because the next weapon won't arrive with a parade. It'll arrive in a plain crate, with a civilian label, and a purpose nobody wants to admit until it's already flying.